All right, and we're back for our fifth episode here as we continue to discuss the ways that we are affected by philosophies of this world, how to separate ourselves or distinguish ourselves to get back to the way that God wants us to think about Him, about our lives, about how we interact with this world. And today we're going to talk about secularism. And really, as we talk about secularism, there's going to be some overlap. As we've talked about fragmentation, about separation, and really what this is a specific form of those ideas, a specific way in which we fragment and separate our lives into separate categories that really should not exist. I mean, these categories should not, at least in the way that we view them today, that we should maybe break down these distinctions and separations. So as we get started, just thinking about definition of terms, as far as how people use secular and maybe talk about what is religious versus secular. How do people use that terminology today, Caleb?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, separation, I think hopefully in this one, we're going to get a little bit more specific with how these things bear out in our lives, because we've talked about separation and fragmentation as like broader philosophic categories. But this is something that you'll hear people all the time say, oh, well, that's a spiritual activity, or this is a religious activity versus that's something secular. So things that pertain to the world or things that pertain to work, anything outside of like church, anything outside of religion is considered secular. And it's very common that you see in even politics. Like almost every politician has to get up and describe how they're not going to let their religious beliefs or spiritual preferences interfere with governance. And the United States is built upon this kind of story or mythos, right? And we might use the word mythos or myth. And what I mean by that just very simply is it's story. Mythos in Greek is story. It's the story of how we make sense of things. And politicians will get up and be like, I'll leave my Catholicism at the door, or I'll leave my Mormonism at the door, or, fill in the blank. And so they have this concept of they can do their duties outside of religious things in a neutral or value free that is not affected by any bias, value system, hierarchy, authority of their religious worldview. And that's going to be separated. So as we can all obviously see, secularism as an idea is separation, fragmentation, as applied to the world around us, our activities, the spheres of influence that we're in, or even in certain spaces. People look at, oh, that's a secular space versus a religious space sometimes as well. So it's kind of those points of fragmentation, separation applied to our lives in some ways.
So I was reading something a while back, and a guy was talking about that very thing you said. Politicians say, I won't bring my religion into this. I won't make decisions based on my religion. And then he gets caught in some scandal with prostitution and embezzlement and so forth. And you go, how could you do this? Well, I left my values at home. You told me I didn't need those when I was doing this job, right? And so we actually do want that guy to bring that with him. Mm-hmm. We just don't want him to bring all of it with him. And so there again is that fragmentation. As I think about this, I do want to acknowledge that we've talked about this when we're talking about separation. There are valid separations. There are valid distinctions and categories. So when you look at the law, when you're reading Leviticus and you see distinctions of what comes into the tabernacle and into the presence of God and into, let's say, formal worship, congregational worship, is distinct from what you might do in day-to-day life. And so there would be holy and common. And that is a valid distinction, what's holy and common. But the issue is, secular is not just a distinction between holy and common. It's saying this has to do with God and this does not have to do with God. Right. That's not a category in the law. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've tried to point out in the book of Leviticus, people will say God doesn't say anything about fill in the blank. God doesn't say anything about that, right?
Whether, brushing your teeth. I heard that.
Yeah, right. God has nothing to say about that.
Yeah.
The book of Leviticus one of the things that it does in the law in general, one of the things it does is show us that God has something to say about everything. And so even when he says that is common, well, he's made a comment on that. And as you walk through the book of Leviticus and add Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you see that when somebody woke up in the morning as an Israelite, if they were truly to apply the law, to apply God's word, to be holy as he is holy, then what they would find is there's not a single thing they would do that day that God had not commented on. When they put their clothes on, God had told them every piece of clothing is to have a blue tassel that is to remind you of my commandments and me. So their clothing would be, and of course the priests, you could escalate that it's even more, but every single Israelite, every piece of clothing was supposed to say something about God. When they ate something, God had divided all the animals in the world into clean and unclean, what you can eat and what you can't eat. And all of that communicated, the nature of those animals communicated something about God and their relationship with God. And so they couldn't eat without thinking about God. And then even when they would go to the bathroom, God in his law comments about how they're supposed to do that. And they're supposed to remove this from the, dig a hole, bury this, right? And so he's even commenting on that function. How you trim your beard is commented on by God, right? There's nothing that you do that God hasn't commented on. And so, and somebody might come along and say, well, yes, but that was a theocratic society.
Right. Or that's just in the old law. That's been totally done away.
Right. And the point I would make is it is, and I don't believe that we live, quote, under the specific regulations of the law. And I think, there's a lot of points to make there. But what we do live under is first of all, the oversight of the same God and what he wanted them to think about him when they were in keeping with those laws are the same things he wants us to think about him now. So that without the specific guidance of put on this piece of clothing, there's still the notion of our clothing should say something about the God we serve. Yeah, or about what we eat. Well, we don't have to worry about clean and unclean. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 4, at the end of 1 Timothy chapter 4, he talks about food and about eating or not eating and people's regulations about that. And he says he doesn't say it doesn't matter. God doesn't care what you eat. He says it is the giving of thanks that sanctifies what you eat.
Yeah.
So we still have a consideration. Every time we eat, we ought to be thinking about God. And so there is no secular activity for the Christian. There is no activity that we engage in that has, quote, nothing to do with God. And I think that's hard for people because we have made those categories.
Right. Yeah. And if we think about that, right, in what that really says, this is outside the purview of God or outside the purview of spirituality. We've immediately fragmented human ontology, who we are, and we've fragmented also our experience. Well, so there are things that I do that are not spiritual, even though I am spirit and soul, right? But those are things that are not spiritual, and God has kind of left them in a moral void or the zone of neutrality. And so God really doesn't care about them at all. And so it's kind of interesting. It's like, oh, well, then I kind of want to go to that area where God doesn't care, because if God doesn't care, then there's no law against it, and I can kind of do whatever I want. There's this sense of like disconnectedness that arises with that. And an example that I mentioned to you before, Stephen, was when I was talking with a brother about this, close friend of mine. He was kind of flabbergasted about the idea of like, what there's no neutrality. Everything is spiritual. How can this possibly be? And he brought up the example of golf. He's like, so Caleb, are you saying that golf is a spiritual activity? And I think what happens and like what he's thinking about and how I used to think about it as well is like, well, let me think about golf. as a game, right? And let me put it in just this kind of like abstract, idealist, almost like platonic form that it exists, by itself. And then let me say if it is spiritual or not. No, golf is not spiritual because I'm not worshiping God. I'm not praying. I'm not really serving others. It's just this neutral activity that's away from everything else. And as I was responding to my friend, I said, well, golf doesn't exist outside of human interaction. We golf, we are golfers, right? And if we think about this in humans inhabiting it, does golf have a spiritual impact? Can it have spiritual consequence? And he's like, well, yeah. And I said, well, let's think about it this way. A father who spends thousands of dollars to get a golf membership instead of helping out his neighbor, that's spiritual import. A father who, instead of spending time with his family, runs off and plays, 3 rounds a week and is spending like 12 to 20 hours a week playing golf instead of being with his family. Is that a spiritual import? Yeah. And so I went down and like actually embodied the idea of golf. I said, let's put it in an actual context here and say, is golf neutral? Is it just secular? And he was kind of like, well, it has spiritual impact, but it's not a spiritual activity. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, man, you're drawing a line that I don't think exists. And why? Yeah. Why is he trying to do this? And I think to give him credit, what he's trying to do is say, well, our spiritual activities are guided by God. And so we can't say it's just up to our determination. It's not up to our judgment, because the Lord's Supper is a spiritual activity, and that's not up to my judgment. That's by God's law. But because God hasn't spoken anything about golf, and golf is not necessarily a work of the church, a spiritual activity, I've got to have judgment involved in that. And because it's not something directly related to the church or a Christian action that's specified in God's word, then it's got to be something that's neutral. Mm-hmm. And so because it's neutral, then I can engage with it and not be in sin or in violation of God's law. And there's a sense in which that's right, because if God had said, thou shalt not play golf, right, that would obviously enter into the realm of transgression and defilement. But just because God hasn't specified on something doesn't necessarily mean it's neutral. Yeah. And because it doesn't exist in this vacuum or a zone of neutrality. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, expand that out a little bit and thinking about just athletic competition in general. The Bible references athletic competition in order to teach spiritual realities, right? Absolutely. And it does it frequently, right? It's not just a passing reference. It points and maybe even goes into some detail in some cases. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, for instance, would develop that out a little bit. And so when I talk to parents, for instance, about their children being involved in athletics, right? The thing that they'll do is talk about all the good things, which is moral value, right? They'll talk about sort of the spiritual values that their children can learn from athletic activity. And so to put that in the positive, you're talking about here's these negative ways golf can affect you. Right. The Bible talks about athletic competition. Here's the positive spiritual ways. But of course, the question I ask those parents is, they can learn all of that, but what are they learning, right? Mm-hmm. Are they engaging in it? And I think too often what we do is we go in with a neutral mindset, as if this has zero effect on me. Mm-hmm. And the reality is it will have an effect. It will always have an effect. And the question is, am I being diligent so that the effect is positive and not negative? If I'm not thinking in moral terms about golf, I can guarantee you it will become a moral negative. Mm-hmm. If I'm not thinking about athletic competition in general, my kids' involvement, if I'm not thinking about that in moral terms, I can guarantee you they're learning the wrong lessons. Because I think we can all agree that just as the children can learn lots of good lessons from athletic competition, you don't have to look very far to see athletes are learning very bad lessons from athletic competition, and it's a spiritual negative. So the way to make sure it's a spiritual positive is to engage with that thoughtfully, to know, yes, this is a spiritual activity. It's going to spiritually affect me. And here's an activity that is not necessarily going to affect me negatively. I can engage in this in a spiritually positive way.
Mm-hmm.
I'll agree. There are activities where the activity is a spiritually negative activity, right?
Yeah. There's no other way to frame it. You're inherently going to be engaged in a defilement.
Yes. Yeah. But then most activities that we call secular fall into a category of that this can be morally positive, spiritually positive, or spiritually negative. But I tell you what, it won't be is spiritually neutral.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is people, when they refer to secular, they act as if this is a thing that has no effect on my spiritual thought processes or my life. And that's just not possible.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from the separation and isolation out of a context. So I hear this a lot. You mentioned the comparison or the idea of the neutral use. I hear this a lot with tools as well, where it's like, well, a hammer is just something neutral. And so golf is akin to a hammer, right? And in this case, and it's like, well, if you could and it's one of these things like Plato thought of these ideals as existing outside of reality, right? In some sense. And there are some sense, and I don't want to get into a critique of Plato, sorry, but there's some positives and negatives to Platonic philosophy. But when you think about a hammer doesn't just exist outside of human interaction. A hammer can be used to murder somebody, or a hammer could be used to build a house that might save someone's life, or fill in the blank. So the context is there, but oftentimes how we talk about it, because we see it can have good use and bad use, we think, oh, it's neutral. And it's like, that's not the context. And actually, I think there's a sense of false security and deceit that comes in, because if I think, oh, this action is neutral, then I can uninhibited, engage in that action and not be in sin because it's neutral. So if golf is neutral or secular, right, then I can engage in that to the fullest without any other considerations of the positive or negative spiritual impacts or realities that I'm engaging, as you're talking about, and think I'm good because it's a neutral activity. And there's without picking on golf, right? I know we've kind of used that as an example. There are, I think, much more serious issues, because if you think of secularity as these neutral spaces, that's the myth that our society's bought into, then it's like, well, schools are this commons, the shared commons, and it's neutral. So education's a neutrality. And you've mentioned the example of like, well, we just want to teach math or whatever the case may be. Entertainment. Disney for a long time was just considered to be this neutral company of sharing good American values or that kind of thing. And whether it's entertainment or education or job or government, this idea was like, well, we'll have this neutral space where there's either an absence of value or there's at least ubiquitous shared values that are all the same, that then we can engage in that with leaving our other values at the door, without bringing them in to change this process. And so, yes, golf is a specific example, but it's also throughout all of our life in society about this concept of secular spaces being separate from spiritual spaces.
Yeah. I'll give you if we can stop picking on golf and give you another example of social media. And I tell you what I think in terms of this. Again, somebody will say it can be used good and it can be used for not good. And the reality is that the good that can be gotten from social media is a thin margin, right? And I don't say it can only produce evil, but it has mostly produced evil. Mm-hmm. And so when you engage in that, if you're not going in with the thought process of this mostly promotes, for a variety of reasons we can't get all into in this one conversation, it mostly trends towards negative spiritual consequences. So I've got to go in with heightened awareness of the dangers, the spiritual dangers that are a part of this tool. It's like, it's like using a chainsaw, right? Somebody says a chainsaw is morally neutral. Man, a chainsaw is a destructive force.
Yeah.
Now, I'm happy to have a chainsaw. when I need to cut a tree down. But I also recognize I am moments away from disaster when I'm using a chainsaw. And so there's got to be heightened awareness. My son is out working with me. When he's out working with me and I'm using a chainsaw, I don't act the same as if he's out working with me and I'm pulling weeds.
Right.
These are one of those is a far more dangerous activity, and the disaster that can come is just always a moment away. And so I think people ought to engage with things like that and look at them not as neutral, but as a varying scale of spiritual danger. Can I get something good out of this? Yes, but boy, I am engaging in dangerous activity, and I need to have the mentality going into that here this is. Along those lines, when I quote this a lot in sermons, Deuteronomy chapter 8, as the people are going into the promised land. You're going to go in, you're going to get all these things that I'm blessing you with, and you're going to live in these houses, you're going to have these vineyards, and you're going to forget me. What God is saying is not, don't engage with all those things. He's saying you're about to go into a dangerous moment, that these blessings, these things that can be used for so much good, can also be used. They're the very things that are going to make you forget me. So it sounds like vineyards and houses and all of these things are not neutral.
Yeah.
But they are moving you spiritually. And can they move you to thankfulness for God? Absolutely. Is that the likely outcome? No.
Yeah. Yeah. And being real about the lack of neutrality, because neutrality kind of it lulls us into a sense of security. It lulls us into dropping our guard. But, oftentimes I think of things in terms of like topology, like geography, like, what if this was really a space that we inhabited? Especially here in Puerto Rico, they have certain like government projects that are basically overrun by gangs. And you don't go in there. You just don't go in there, because unless you know the head leader of the gang, you're probably going to die. That's not a neutral territory. But then there are certain areas around that you're probably not going to get shot, but you could get shot. It's kind of more neutral area. The police, still drive by. The police don't even go into the project areas. That's definitely not neutral territory. But the police will drive by in those streets. And if I was talking to somebody who come visit Puerto Rico, I was like, oh yeah, it's okay. Last month, only 2 people died on that street. It's kind of like neutral ground. The gang doesn't fully control it. Would they go out there without an escort or anything? No, they wouldn't just be like, oh, it's neutral territory. It's okay, I'm going to be hunky-dory. We understand this in a physical, like visceral sense when we think about it in terms of safety on a physical level. But when we get to these myths of larger or higher level orders of society, interaction, civilization, government, education, whatever the case may be, we just kind of lose all sight of that basic pattern of reality. It's just like, oh, it's neutral. Why is it neutral? Well, because the Bible doesn't specify exactly on it, because we're all sharing in it together. It doesn't have value. It's a non-spiritual activity. All these justifications that are used for it. And it's just insane, because somebody using social media is the exact same as somebody walking down a neutral street right next to the gang controlled projects. They wouldn't do it, but yet they let their kids do it, and without any inhibition. Yeah. So one thing, transitioning here a little bit. Okay, we kind of have explained basically what secularism is. How did it arise? How did we get to this point? Is it important to even know why we're here, or is it always been the case? Like, didn't the apostles in the New Testament have like a secular spiritual split, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think at some level there are separations and there are distinctions, and I would call it layers more than secular sacred divide. But Paul, for instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, as he's counseling them to withdraw fellowship from this brother who is walking disorderly, he says, I did not mean not to keep company with the people of the world, right? What do I have to do with that? So he makes a distinction between how we interact with the church and how we interact with the world. And so we want to appreciate that. But that doesn't mean that what he's saying is, I don't think those things are wrong when the world does them. All he means is I don't have jurisdiction over that, right? That my focus is the church. Now, I still preach against those things in the world, and I still teach that those things are wrong. Right. And I think what's happened is, because the world became, especially the Western world, became, to use the term loosely, Christianized, that loosely followed the morals of the Bible. We came to a place, coming out of Enlightenment thought processes and so forth, where it said we can't all agree on religious things. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to, and a lot of that got attributed to religious wars, so-called religious wars and so forth. Basically, all wars start with religion, religious disagreements and so forth, which I think is a gross misrepresentation. But so to avoid all of that, we're going to set religious matters over into a private area of concern. And what we're going to say is in public, we're going to say we can agree on these issues. Now, a lot of that would be math, natural truths, let's say math, science, and so forth. Mm-hmm. But taking God out is not a neutral decision, obviously. I say obviously, it should be obvious. Taking God out and saying we're going to just agree on what we can agree on without God. Well, you can't do that, right? Because the natural presumes the existence of God. And when you start examining the natural without God, you have to come up with alternate explanations for what you're seeing besides that God created all of this. So that's where we get evolution from. Mm-hmm. Evolution is not, it doesn't come up from neutral ground. It comes up from somebody saying, let's start with the premise that there's not God. That's not a value-free zone, right? And so when somebody says, let's agree on math without God. Okay, the without God part's not neutral. And so we've already conceded ground. And I think even Christians would say, like in the area of education and so forth, that they've agreed to the sort of pluralistic goal that we need a pluralistic society. We need a society where we can all get along, even in our disagreements. Mm-hmm. But then what we've conceded is that the foundational truth that God exists, that God is, and that he created the world, that is one of those facts that we don't have to agree on. But then we thought that we could keep everything that's built on that fact. And that would be neutral territory. But we already made a non-neutral decision.
Yep. And just to put this in a personal experience so people can kind of maybe visualize this. Imagine going to Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner, and your mom has made, or your aunt or grandma, whoever, has made the whole banquet, right? And you're like, well, some of us really don't like mom very much. And we argue with her. So to enjoy this Christmas meal or Thanksgiving meal, we're going to kick mom out of the house. And then we're going to eat the meal together. And there we can have unity. And can you imagine doing that? Number one, it'd be extremely offensive. And then when the father comes to defend his wife or the mother and says, hey, you guys shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Everyone's like, well, it was just neutral. It was not an offense against her. It was just a value free. We just want to be able to start the meal without any previous baggage, so to speak. It'd be insane. Nobody would do that.
Take that illustration just a little bit further. You get to enjoy that meal, but guess what happens next Thanksgiving? And I think that's what we're starting to see right now is you don't get to keep having the meal without the maker of the meal.
Yep.
And just you sparked a thought. Years ago, we bought a book about Thanksgiving, and a thrift store or something. Amy liked the illustrations, and it was talking about the first Thanksgiving and Pilgrims and Indians and so forth. And all throughout, it's talking about thankfulness for this and that and the other thing. And they get to the end and thankfulness. And God was not mentioned in it anywhere. And, the first time we read, after we got home and read all the way through it, we were like, wow, this, what they want, they like gratitude. You talk about Western philosophy, self-help stuff. Gratitude's all through there.
Sure.
To who?
The universe, they say.
Right. Right. And so there's just this big gaping hole. What you want is the sentiment. Gratitude's a good thing, right? It's a helpful thing, but you've taken away the recipient of that gratitude. And then you think you still get to keep the mentality that is good without the object or the target of that mentality. And that's what's happening in so many areas, right? The thing that all of these benefits of Christianity, all of these benefits of God's word and God's established morality, you can take that away, and then we get to keep the common ground.
Yeah.
But we act like that common ground was arrived at without God.
Yep.
But it was not. And that's the real thing. The secularists have been borrowing from God for a long time, while refusing to acknowledge that that's where they got it from. The atheist books, the new atheist books that came out in 2016, all of them were making 2006. All of them were making the cases that atheists can be moral, not without stealing from God.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And so Western thought in the United States has existed and been established on this foundation of secularism. And the notion of pluralism in unity and diversity, has been exalted as a superseding priority and ultimate value, while not being self-aware of the fact that their value has been imposed on all these other things and orients even the so-called secular spaces. And so we've seen the development of this over generations, right? And so when Stephen and I, when we're talking about this, right, we're not trying to just, harp on the millennials or the boomers or anybody born within the last 150 years, because this was something in motion hundreds and hundreds of years. That is a very domineering system of thought that invades our thought processes and our ability to discern the world. And so one of the things that people today are talking about, they feel that we're in times of transition, and even non-Christians are bit at that. Sorry, about to start speaking Spanish. Even people in Spanish, yeah, and it's not just in the U.S. People all over the Western world understand, like, wow, we are kind of at the precipice of the cracks are starting to get cracky. The foundation's kind of breaking. Things are having problems here, and it's interesting as there was kind of this big move to globalization, the big moves to kind of this universal system that was built upon this secular myth or a pluralistic myth that goes hand in hand with secularity. That's starting to fall apart. And so what you're starting to see is people, one, they don't trust each other. They've started realizing also these neutral things are not neutral. The kind of veil has been lifted. There's been an unveiling, an apocalypse that's taken place. And real quick on that, just a story that's affected Christians. I had friends and family members that really liked Disney a lot and wanted to take kids to Disney, and even invited our family and said, hey, let's all go to Disney. And this was several years ago now. And I was like, no, we're not going to Disney. Well, why? It's, just a fun park and all that stuff. And I've been to Disney, went to school in Florida, and we would go to Disney. And I realized, like, no, the theme park is not a neutral ground. There is conditioning, there's values, there's a whole lot of things. And even before you step foot in the park, there's a lot of values that you have to kind of accept and digest to get into that. But I was met with resistance. People were like, man, Caleb, you're just a curmudgeon. You don't want your kids to have fun, blah, 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 all these things. And then within like a few months, the whole thing about the Disney board coming out with having the trans kids and, them expressing their motive to try to change the perspectives, the Overton window, and trying to influence people on this. And the whole mask of neutrality, and then the Disney concept of like neutral good values, or like going back to that gratitude of family values, that was unmasked and thrown off. And now you see Disney with this just ugly corporatism of just mirroring the demonic influences of the United States.
Hmm.
And it's just like, oh, we don't want that. And so, but still people are trying to like, have it kind of both ways and be like, well, we don't support that aspect of it. And still the separation, fragmentation that comes through. But I think more and more people are starting to realize this idea of a suspended neutral commons is gone. And so now it's like, well, what do we have? We don't have religion that binds us together. We don't really have shared culture that binds us together anymore. The internet has provided, yes, places to discuss things, but it also allows for isolation and kind of echo chambers. And I don't have to interact with my neighbors. I can just find people of like mind, and interact with them. And so we've lost any kind of trust that is required for that common grounds. And I'm not trying to say that the common grounds or the myth of secularity was good, but it did provide some benefits. And I think you've mentioned like Jonathan Haidt and others and Pinker that have kind of longed for the 1990s and the 1980s. And I think that was kind of probably like the height, right? The zenith of the secularist movement and kind of its heyday. But it's been a precipitous fall and digression since then. And I think people are kind of starting to look around and be like, wait, is civil war going to happen? Are we going to fragment into different things? You see more nationalist movements across the world, more independence movements. Things are starting to break down because that myth cannot hold a civilization together.
Yeah. And what I see, now what we have is, what people call the woke movement or whatever. Mm-hmm. What that actually is people on the quote other side recognizing that there's no neutrality. They're recognizing we can't be value free and that we are at odds, that there is spiritual warfare and we're on this side. And they're willing to, as it were, take up arms, right? You've got Disney coming out, as you mentioned, and it's not just Disney, I mean, across the board coming out and saying, this is our goal. Right. So they don't produce content under the delusion of moral neutrality. They're producing content with moral goals. And what's sad is that they're more aware of their moral direction than Christians who are consuming it, right? And that I hope Christians are waking up and saying, oh, this was all conditioning, right? And this has been happening for a very long time, right? And stories, it's impossible to tell a story value free.
Yeah,
that's absolutely right. You cannot. And so that's what we thought. We thought our television shows, can we go back to Andy Griffith? Go watch Andy Griffith, with some awareness. It's not neutral. Now, a lot of what it's teaching, you might go, yeah, I agree with that. Mm-hmm. But you'll also see some things along the way and go, oh, I see. There was a seed planted, right? Yeah. And so, and the writers of those shows were not morally neutral, right? Yeah. They were change agents, as it were. They're secularists who were pressing that secular worldview. And so you see all of that along the way, and you start realizing, Leave It to Beaver. I brought this up recently. Leave It to Beaver is a show where you have a lot of quote Christian values and no Christianity. Yeah. God is not a part of Leave It. Church is not a part of Leave It to Beaver. And so you have this sort of a subtlety that is, listen, you can have all of this without all of that churchiness, right? That's not a value-free message. Mm-hmm. That is teaching you that you can be good without God, and you cannot.
Yeah, and I think this is, as I start to think about this in more of a longitudinal way, it's really a brilliant long-term strategy from Satan, because if the church, right, is like presented, especially in Matthew 16, as this attacking force, it's assailing the gates of Hades, right? And the gates of Hades aren't going to be able to stop it. And we, as the soldiers of Christ, we are armed with the panoply of God. And yet, if Satan's like, hang on a second, we all have to work together here, or we're just going to mutually destroy each other. So lay down your arms, put the armor back, come in here in neutral ground, and we can parlay. We can have these terms of discussion, and it's just like, whoa, what happens? We as Christians did that. We're like, all right, we'll leave the Bible behind. We'll leave the church behind. We'll leave our value systems formed and necessitating God behind, and we'll arrive at this secular place. And then what happens? We have lost countless in terms of the church, generation after generation. The attrition rate of loss of young Christians is somewhere around 70 to 80%. We have been gutted from the inside out, and we are being attacked and assailed by all sides. And some are starting to wake up and be like, wait a second, Satan didn't even abide by his own rules. Like, he didn't come into this neutral zone with neutral things. They brought all their weapons to it, and this was just a big ruse. They threw up the white flag, and we have to understand, like, there is no white flag from Satan. But that's kind of like what he did. We get there, we disarmed, and then bam, he just took he took a beating to us, and yet some of us are still pining for that time of neutral zones and neutrality with society. And it's like, no, guys, there's no going back to it. And number one, we shouldn't have ever been there in the first place, because the results have been
well, and that's what the sort of moderate, if you will, secularists, the ones who still believe in the neutral zone. You know, we mentioned Jonathan Haidt and Pinker. Mm-hmm. That's what they think. If we could just dial back the rhetoric. Yeah. And just get to a place where we distinguish between, you know, private moral values versus public, you know, agreements. And what they don't realize, we don't agree. You know, I was reading Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, and he was talking about cell phone usage, which is a lot of what he deals with in that book. And he's talking about, you know, how pornography messes with the brains of adolescents. And one of the things he says is, I'm not saying viewing pornography is wrong. That is not a neutral statement. Yeah. Right. What you're saying is, I'm not saying get rid of pornography. I'm just, and so he's like saying it just, I don't want it to mess with young men's brains. I'm fine with it destroying the brains of older men, or he's not even willing to admit that it destroys the brains. Right. And so here's a man who, because he is trying to hold to this sort of spiritual neutrality, and he's observing damage, but his spiritual neutrality, or his supposed spiritual neutrality, makes him unable to make a judgment, because he's trying to stay in that neutral place. Yep. And if you keep a neutral stance on pornography, then you can't say it's bad here but not here, right? Mm-hmm. It's damaging here but not here. You just can't go there. Yeah. And so he's continuing to live in a myth. And I think and I know not on pornography, but there are a lot of Christians who are like Haidt and want to say, can we just go back to when movies weren't woke? Right. And what we mean is just turn the volume down. Right. Yeah. I don't mind.
Or move away from the extremes a little. We just want to get to
That's it. So all right, here, Christian, I don't know what the latest Disney movie was that came out that she was telling me about, and that they'd taken the kids to see. And she said it was surprisingly not near as woke as most things. I said, oh, really? And so I started asking some questions. And it preached feminism. It preached, independent spirit and rebellion against parents, rebellion against tradition, and all of these things. But at least it wasn't pushing transgenderism. And so, you know, what's really dangerous is the volume gets so high so that we clearly see that we're in a battle of values. Yeah. And the danger is that we are satisfied turning the volume back down and think that warfare at a lower volume is not warfare. Mm-hmm. But it was always warfare. Yeah. And we were lulled and have been changed, because we've been lulled into thinking, oh, there's no real values in this movie or that movie. You know, could we just go back to, you know, The Little Mermaid? Oh, you mean the movie where the whole movie, this girl is saying her dad is wrong and she's right. And the conclusion of that movie is a dad apologizing to his rebellious and disobedient daughter for the mess that she's made of everything. That's value free.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, it's not. And there's several points on that. I'm glad you brought this up about the idea of kind of moderation, because this is something I've seen even among Christians where they kind of pride themselves on taking a moderate standpoint. I'm not extremist over here, and I'm more kind of neutral guy. And although, I don't know if he would consider himself a Christian or not, I'm not trying to call him one or not. But Jordan Peterson, for a long time, kind of straddled that line between atheists and theists, because he was kind of like, well, I'm a go-between. And one of the things that, J.R. Bronger, well-known brother and preacher, one thing that he would harp on when I was listening to him when I was younger, and I appreciate the point, he said, you know what profane means? Profane is a threshold walker, someone who kind of goes between the two. And this is why amphibious things, symbolically in Christian cosmology, are considered profane things, because they don't have a proper designation. And so just because a Christian's moderated doesn't mean they're right. Should you moderate between a genocidal dictator and someone who's trying to defend the poor and the innocent? No, like there's not a moderate position there. And that's what we're dealing with in these situations with the warfare that's going on. And even thinking about it aside from the warfare position, people, once they begin to distrust this myth of neutrality, it then becomes very tribal. And this is something that I see in American politics as, being outside of the mainland U.S., it kind of looks a little bit different to me now, but I see there's situations where the Democrats or the left will say, well, the right did this, they overstepped their bounds. And then the right will come and then the left will say, no, we have to abide by procedure or neutrality or all this kind of stuff. And then the right for some time is kind of like, okay, we'll abide by that. Well, they've kind of had the mask lifted on both parties, right? And like, there's no neutrality here. They're not working. They each got their agendas, their biases and stuff. And now it's just kind of like, no, we're going to take everything. And you're going to kind of strike me. I'm going to strike you 2 times as harder. You're going to mess up this Senate procedure. We're going to mess it up even more. Yeah. And it's just this complete de-evolution of things. There is escalation, and the secular myth cannot hold a civilization together because it asks us on an individual and societal level to strip away value, to break our sense of being, our senses of community. And when you break that for a supposed neutrality that holds supposedly no value, there's nothing to really bind you to that. And so you see a decrease in love for country, a decrease in sense of national pride, patriotism, and all this kind of stuff. And then once all that's taken away and you're kind of living under this perspective of suspicion, it's like, why should I do this for my fellow countrymen? What do I have to do with you? And it reminds me a lot of like, after Rehoboam ascends to the throne in 1 Kings chapter 12, and they're just like, you betrayed us. We gave everything for you, and now you're just a scumbag that wants more out of us. To your tents, Israel. We're done with you. And sadly, like, I'm not trying to prophesy or anything here, but the writing's kind of on the wall in terms of the destabilization of society, the escalation of certain things. And sadly, many Christians are getting swept up into that. And I think the answer here is, one, reinvestigating how we got to this point and how we get back, how we get to where we need to go. And the back, as you've mentioned, is not in some idealistic Leave It to Beaver or 1950s situation. The back is the New Testament model, is the apostolic age of where we need to get to, which is going to lead us to an integration and not ceding neutral territory over to the enemy. The apostles never did that, ever. And they never took moderate positions for the sake of popularity either.
Absolutely. And part of that, look, and we'll get more into solutions later, but the solution here is not a Christian nationalism approach, but the solution is for us is to recognize the spiritual warfare and recognize we're sojourners and pilgrims. Yep. That we are not we're not living in a world that is respectful of God and respectful of God's things. And what we have to recognize is that our devotion to that is so primary. We can never make that one of the neutral things. Like sometimes I think what we in our interaction with the world, we think that we can be, I don't want to say on good terms, because I think we can, like for as much as possible, we live peaceably with all men. I think we can be kind and
hospitable
and so forth to the world, but we ought to have a mentality that says, if this man does not believe God exists, I'm sort of treating him like somebody who doesn't believe in gravity. I'm not going to be cruel. I'm not going to be, but I'm also going to just operate with an assumption of this man is not stable. This man is not on stable ground. And I can't treat him as if, this is what we do with the experts, right? Secularism and so forth. We say, these are the people that know. And yet they've started with the very first premise that the Proverbs say makes you a fool. They have denied that there is God. At a fundamental level, this is a fool. And I have to operate under those terms because these are the terms God has given me. And I look around and say, yes, I live in a world that is ruled by folly. So what's my job? Well, it's not to be ruled by folly, right? It's not to agree to the terms of folly, which may make me an outcast inherently, not because I am rude and obnoxious purposefully to that foolish world order, but because that's what folly does. It hates righteousness. Mm-hmm. And the more the world becomes ruled by that, the more we're going to have to acknowledge. And I think that's one of the things is as the world is moving in a certain direction, people are going to have to become more aware of we're not living in neutral territory. Yeah. That we are living in a world that is hostile to the things of God. And
there's opportunity. Sorry to interject. There's opportunity absolutely. In that. Because I'll hear, and you and I've mentioned this before in our conversations, that people will talk about, now paganism is becoming popular. And it's like, well, why? Well, because this veil of neutrality is being taken away. And so people are just being more open and blatant. They've always been pagan, they just kind of framed it in a different way or hid it or whatever the case may be. And so now these things are coming out, and instead of lamenting that, and I was talking to an older Christian, and he was like, man, I dread to think about the days that your children and your grandchildren will see. And I'm like, yeah, undoubtedly they're going to be difficult, but in some ways it'll be better because at least we'll be on clear terms. Like we'll know what we're dealing with rather than this kind of like subtle subterfuge of Satan, like the kind of a psyops thing. And we're finally kind of moving past that. So
I think about the Rechabites, and you and I have talked about them before. Mm-hmm. Back in Jehu's day, Jonadab saw the situation and he made a proclamation for his family. And I think he saw where things were headed. And he said, we're going to make some additional separations, right? I'm going to make some additional judgments that will keep us separated from the trends that I'm seeing in Israel. And then over a century later, Jeremiah comes along and he calls out the descendants of Jonadab, the Rechabites, and he says, look, here they are. And what has probably looked like overreaction and silliness for generations now comes to fruition as the way. Mm-hmm. Here was the way to stay faithful in this kind of world. And I think that there are people who've been making these sort of more, I don't say radical. I mean, they are, but I don't want to just use that word. Maybe taking a stronger stance against the directions of the world and having a more heightened awareness of the warfare, right? Mm. And for years, they've looked, those people don't have a TV. Here's these people over here. They don't they don't participate in these activities. They don't go to Disney or whatever it is.
Yeah. Or they're extremists or hyper conservative or fill in the blank. Yeah.
And now it's getting to the place of like Jeremiah, you're like going, oh, yeah, maybe we'd be better without a TV. Yeah. Maybe we do need to distance ourselves. And it's not what I want to be careful of. It's not that has just now become a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's now that we're recognizing the goodness of that idea.
Yeah. It's always been good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And secularism has always been bad.
Yes.
It's not just because it's breaking down now. It's always been that case. And anything in secularism is not going to be the last iteration of this. If Christ does not return, humanity is going to try to get back to this, or to have a different type of mythos that's going to say we can achieve pluralism and have peace and prosperity, or whatever the case may be. And Christians need to be, I think, very cautious about this. The language we've used is like ceding ground, and like it's almost kind of like I'm trying to think of the word. When you had pre-World War II, where they just kind of pacified Hitler, and this kind of thing of just like, well, we'll let that go. And there's a lot of things that hopefully we'll talk more about in the future, because it's not just in terms of this common neutral ground, but it's also in a lot of other areas, whether it's science or art or fill in the blank. It's like what you said. You go into these things and you say, well, to engage in these, we need to take away God first. Whatever the case may be, if you're having to do that, you need to stop and just be like, this is not the right way. This is not the right territory. And we also need to be very careful with it too, just in terms of how we order our lives. I know it's made a huge impact on me. Instead of just going and thinking, oh, this is a secular action, this is just soccer, this is just karate, this is just golf, or this is just a movie. Starting to think about it in terms of spiritual impact, praying about those things, submitting them to God, it will change the way that we actually live. But if we continue to go under the mythos of it, we're going to continue to see the problems, and we're going to continue to be on that same train track to the blown out bridge and destruction. And sadly, our youth are suffering for it. Many of us have suffered for it. And so we've had how many generations now? At least probably 3, maybe 4 generations of this failed experiment. And so it's high time we made a change on this. So.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, all right, brother, it's a good conversation. And I hope, I know there's still a lot of, we're staying in the philosophical realm, trying to bring some practical examples along. We will get more practical as we get into solution mentalities. How do we react to this? We're hinting at it along the way. Really what we're laying the groundwork right now for is, what's the problem? And this is just another one of those problems. We'll start talking soon about what are the sources of these problems, backing up a little bit. We've hinted at that. And then our conclusion hopefully is, how do we rise to these challenges? And so we'll be talking more about that. Stay with us and continue to think along these lines together. Appreciate it, Caleb, and look forward to next time.
Likewise. God bless. Thanks.
God bless.